Prince Alexander had always been a man of routine. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, he would make his way through the marble corridors of Raven's Hollow Palace, his footsteps echoing against the ancient stone walls that had housed his family for generations. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite place why. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle with unease. As he approached the oak doors of the morning room where Princess Catherine would be taking her breakfast, he noticed something unusual. The ornate handles, crafted from centuries-old brass, felt cold beneath his touch, despite the warmth of the summer morning filtering through the tall windows. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the door, listening to the silence that seemed to press against him from all sides. The palace staff moved about their duties with their usual quiet efficiency, but even their whispered conversations seemed muted today. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had served his family since before his birth, had given him an odd look when he passed her in the hallway. Her usually bright smile had been replaced by something he couldn't quite read, concern perhaps, or maybe sympathy. It was the kind of expression people wore when they knew something you didn't, when they carried a burden they couldn't share. Alexander straightened his shoulders and pushed open the door, expecting to find Catherine seated at the small round table by the window, her dark hair catching the morning light as she read through her correspondence. Instead, the sight that greeted him stopped him cold in the doorway. The morning room, usually filled with the gentle sounds of clinking china and rustling papers, was eerily quiet. The table was set as always with the finest bone china and silver that had been in his family for generations, but only one place setting remained untouched. Catherine sat in her usual chair, but everything about her posture spoke of defeat. Her shoulders, normally held with the regal bearing that had made her such a natural fit for royal life, were slumped forward. Her hands rested limply in her lap, no longer holding the morning newspapers or the stack of invitations that usually demanded her attention. Most striking of all were her eyes, those brilliant, green eyes that had first captured his heart at a charity gala 5 years ago, now filled with tears that she didn't even try to wipe away. The silence, stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Alexander felt his heart begin to race, though he didn't yet understand why. Something fundamental had shifted in his world, and he could sense it the way animals sense an approaching storm. The very air in the room seemed to vibrate with unspoken words, with secrets that hung between them like a chasm he wasn't sure how to cross. Scattered across the Persian rug at Catherine's feet lay several pieces of paper, their edges slightly crumpled as if they had been gripped too tightly before being discarded. From where he stood, Alexander could see official letterheads and formal seals, the kind of correspondence that usually meant important state business or family matters. But there was something different about these papers, something that made his stomach clench with a dread he couldn't name. The morning light streaming through the tall windows created patterns on the walls, the same patterns he had seen countless times before, but today they seemed foreign and ominous. Everything in this room that had been his sanctuary, their sanctuary, now felt charged with an energy that spoke of change, of endings, of revelations that couldn't be taken back once spoken. Catherine's wedding ring caught the light as she finally moved, raising one trembling hand to her face. The simple platinum band that had symbolized their union, their commitment to each other and to the crown, now seemed to weigh heavily on her finger. Alexander found himself staring at it, remembering the day he had placed it there, surrounded by thousands of well-wishers and the hopes of an entire nation. The contrast between that joyful day and this moment of silent despair couldn't have been more stark. Then, Catherine had been radiant, her smile lighting up Westminster Abbey as she promised to stand by his side through whatever challenges their royal life might bring. Now she looked fragile, breakable, as if the wrong word or gesture might shatter her completely. Alexander remained frozen in the doorway, part of him wanting to rush to her side, and part of him terrified of what he might discover if he moved closer to those discarded papers. His mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Had something happened to her family? Was there a scandal brewing that would rock the foundation of the monarchy? Or was this something more personal, more devastating to their private world? The grandfather clock in the corner chimed the half-hour, its deep, resonant tones seeming to mock the stillness that had settled over them. Catherine didn't even flinch at the sound, didn't acknowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. She simply continued to stare at nothing, tears flowing down her cheeks in steady streams that spoke of a grief too deep for words. Alexander realized that whatever had happened, whatever those papers contained, his life was about to change forever. The comfortable routine of their royal existence, the carefully orchestrated public appearances and private moments, all of it hung in the balance of this single, terrible moment. As he stood there, still unable to move or speak, he understood that some doors once opened could never be closed again. The sound of his own breathing seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence of the morning room. Alexander finally found the strength to step across the threshold, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo like thunder in the stillness. Each step toward Catherine felt like walking through deep water, his movements slow and deliberate as if the very air had thickened around him. Catherine looked up at the sound of his approach, and the expression on her face nearly brought him to his knees. It wasn't anger or disappointment that he saw there. Those emotions he could have handled, could have fought against or worked to resolve. Instead, her eyes held a profound sadness mixed with something that looked almost like pity. It was the expression of someone who had discovered a terrible truth and was about to share that burden with the person they loved most. "Catherine," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The single word seemed to hang in the air between them, weighted with all the questions he was afraid to ask. She didn't respond immediately, instead reaching down to gather the scattered papers from the floor. Her movements were careful and precise, as if she were handling explosives that might detonate at the slightest disturbance. As she arranged the documents on the table between them, Alexander caught glimpses of official seals and formal headers. His heart sank as he recognized the insignia of the Royal Medical Council, the private body that handled all health matters concerning the royal family. Whatever this was about, it was serious enough to warrant their highest level of confidentiality and protocol. "I've been waiting for you," Catherine said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "I knew you would come here to our place, before going anywhere else." Their morning room had indeed become their sanctuary over the years, the one place in the vast palace where they could simply be husband and wife rather than public figures carrying the weight of a nation's expectations. Alexander moved to his usual chair across from her but didn't sit down. Something in her posture warned him that he might need to remain standing, might need to be ready for whatever blow was coming. "What's happened?" he asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Catherine's hands trembled as she pushed the top document toward him. "The test results came back yesterday evening," she said, each word carefully measured. "Dr. Morrison wanted to deliver them personally, but I insisted on receiving them in writing first. I needed time to understand what this means for us." The paper felt heavy in Alexander's hands, far heavier than its physical weight should have allowed. The letterhead confirmed his fears. This was from the Royal Medical Council's fertility specialist, the discreet doctor who had been quietly monitoring their situation for the past 18 months. As his eyes scanned the clinical language and medical terminology, the full weight of their private struggle became clear. For nearly 2 years they had been trying to conceive an heir. It had started as a joyful secret between them, shared smiles and whispered hopes in the privacy of their bedroom. When months passed without success, they had consulted the royal physicians discreetly, submitting to test after test while maintaining their public facade of newlywed bliss. The document in his hands contained the final verdict on those tests, delivered in the cold, impersonal language of medical science. The words seemed to blur together as he read them, technical terms that added up to one devastating conclusion. The problem wasn't with Catherine as they had both secretly feared. The problem was with him. Alexander felt the paper slip from his fingers as the full implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. As the future king, his primary duty, arguably his only truly essential duty, was to produce an heir to continue the royal line. Everything else he did, every ribbon he cut and every state dinner he attended was secondary to this one fundamental responsibility. And now, according to the most respected medical professionals in the country, that might be impossible. "The numbers are quite conclusive," Catherine continued, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Morrison wants to discuss treatment options, but he was very clear about the odds. Even with the most advanced fertility treatments available, the chances of natural conception are," she trailed off, unable to say the words that would make it real. Alexander sank into his chair, his legs no longer able to support him. The room seemed to spin around him as he tried to process what this meant, not just for them personally, but for the monarchy, for the line of succession, for the very future of the crown that had been passed down through his family for over 1,000 years. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "Since 7 o'clock last night," Catherine replied. "I've been sitting here since 5 this morning, trying to find the words, trying to figure out how to tell you that your greatest fear has come true." The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest fear had indeed always been failing in his duty to the crown. As a child, he had worried about not being smart enough, strong enough, or worthy enough to be king. As he grew older, those fears had evolved but never disappeared. Now it seemed he had failed before his reign had even begun. Catherine reached across the table and took his hand, her touch warm despite the coldness that seemed to have settled into his bones. "We'll find another way," she whispered. "There are treatments, procedures, options we haven't explored yet. This doesn't have to be the end." But Alexander could see in her eyes that she didn't quite believe her own words. They both understood the weight of royal expectations, the pressure that would only increase as time passed without an announcement of a pregnancy. The media speculation, the public concern, the quiet conversations among government officials about the succession, it would all intensify until it became unbearable. "The irony is," Alexander said bitterly, "I've spent my entire life preparing to be king, and the one thing that actually qualifies me for the job is the one thing I apparently cannot do." Catherine's grip on his hand tightened. "You are so much more than just a future father, Alexander. You're going to be an extraordinary king with or without an heir." But they both knew that in the eyes of the Constitution, the Parliament, and the people, a king without an heir was a king who had failed in his most basic duty. The weight of that knowledge settled over them like a shroud, transforming their private sanctuary into a tomb for their hopes and dreams. The silence that followed Catherine's reassurances stretched between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Alexander stared at the medical documents spread across their breakfast table, the formal language seeming to mock the intimacy of their morning ritual. The delicate china cups, still filled with cooling tea, the untouched pastries arranged on silver plates. Everything looked the same as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Yet nothing would ever be the same again. "There's something else," Catherine said quietly, and Alexander's heart clenched at the hesitation in her voice. He had thought the worst was over, that they had reached the bottom of this devastating revelation. Her expression told him otherwise. She pulled another document from beneath the medical reports, this one bearing the seal of his father's private secretary. Alexander recognized the formal stationery immediately. It was the kind used for the most sensitive royal communications, the ones that never appeared in official records and were destroyed after reading. "This arrived by special courier an hour after the medical results," Catherine explained, her hands shaking slightly as she passed the letter to him. "It's from your father. Apparently rumors have already begun circulating in certain circles about our situation." Alexander felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as he unfolded the heavy paper. His father's handwriting, usually so confident and bold, seemed more hurried than usual, as if the king had written this letter in a state of barely controlled urgency. The message was brief, but devastating. Palace sources had leaked information about their medical consultations to certain members of the government. While no specifics had been shared, the very fact that the heir to the throne was consulting fertility specialists had been enough to trigger quiet conversations about the succession. The Prime Minister had already made discreet inquiries about the constitutional implications of a childless reign. "They're moving quickly," Alexander said, his voice hollow. "Faster than I thought possible." Catherine nodded, fresh tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Your father suggests we consider making a public announcement about our medical situation to get ahead of any speculation. He thinks transparency might be our best option." The thought of their most private struggle becoming public fodder made Alexander feel physically ill. He could already imagine the headlines, the talk show discussions, the endless speculation about their marriage and their fitness to rule. Every aspect of their relationship would be dissected by strangers, their love reduced to clinical discussions about royal duty and constitutional requirements. "There's more," Catherine continued, and Alexander wondered how there could possibly be anything else. "Your brother called this morning. James wanted to give us a heads up before we heard it from someone else." Prince James, Alexander's younger brother, had always lived in the shadow of the heir apparent. While Alexander had been groomed for kingship from birth, James had enjoyed the relative freedom of being the spare, pursuing his military career and living a life largely outside the public eye. Alexander had never envied his brother that freedom more than he did in this moment. The constitutional lawyers have been asked to prepare a briefing on alternative succession scenarios, Catherine said, each word seeming to cut deeper than the last. "They're exploring what would happen if you were to renounce your claim to the throne." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Renounce the throne, something no heir apparent had done in over a century, something that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. The idea was so foreign, so impossible that he couldn't immediately process what it would mean. "They're already planning my replacement," he said bitterly. "Before we've even had a chance to explore our options, they're writing me off." Catherine moved around the table to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "That's not what this is," she said firmly. "Your father explicitly said these are just precautionary measures, preparations for every possible scenario. No one is giving up on us." But Alexander could read between the lines of the formal language and diplomatic phrasing. The monarchy was an institution first and a family second. If he couldn't fulfill his primary duty as king, the institution would find a way to continue without him. It was as simple and as brutal as that. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Alexander asked, his voice cracking with emotion he had been trying to suppress. "It's not the throne I'm losing. It's not even the disappointment of my father or the constitutional crisis we're causing. It's the look in your eyes right now." Catherine's face crumpled at his words, and she pressed her forehead against their joined hands. "What look?" "The look that says you're wondering if you married the wrong brother," Alexander said quietly. "The look that says you're calculating whether your life would have been different if you had chosen someone who could give you children." "Stop," Catherine whispered. But Alexander couldn't stop now that the words had started flowing. "James is healthy, successful, and unmarried. He could step into my role and give the monarchy everything it needs, including heirs. You could have chosen him at that charity gala 5 years ago. You could have been happy with someone who wouldn't have put you through this nightmare." Catherine looked up at him then, her green eyes blazing with an intensity that cut through his spiral of self-pity. "Do you really think so little of me?" she asked, her voice sharp with hurt. "Do you honestly believe that I married you for your title, for your ability to father children? For anything other than the fact that I fell completely and hopelessly in love with you?" Alexander started to respond, but she pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I didn't fall in love with the future king. I fell in love with the man who spent an entire evening at a stuffy charity dinner, talking to the shy girl in the corner about her work with homeless children. I fell in love with the man who remembered my birthday before we were even dating, and sent me a single white rose with a note that made me cry happy tears." She stood and began pacing the length of the morning room, her emotional barriers finally cracking after hours of controlled composure. "I fell in love with the man who holds my hand during thunderstorms because he knows they frighten me, who brings me tea when I'm working late, who makes me laugh even on the worst days. None of that has anything to do with heirs or crowns or constitutional duties." Alexander watched her pace, feeling something shift inside his chest. In his despair, he had forgotten the most important truth of their relationship, that it had begun with love, not duty. That whatever challenges they faced them together. "The medical report doesn't change who you are," Catherine continued, stopping in front of his chair. "It doesn't make you less of a man, less of a husband, or less of a future king. It just means we have to find a different path forward than the one we originally planned." For the first time since he had walked into the morning room and found her crying, Alexander felt a spark of hope. Not for easy answers or miraculous solutions, but for the possibility that they could navigate this crisis without losing themselves or each other in the process. Alexander stood and pulled Catherine into his arms, holding her tightly as if she might disappear if he loosened his grip. For the first time in hours, the knot of panic in his chest began to ease slightly. Her words had reminded him of who they were beneath the titles and expectations. Two people who had chosen each other long before duty and obligation had complicated their lives. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry for doubting us, for doubting you. I I've never felt so powerless before. Catherine pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. We'll figure this out, she said with a conviction that surprised them both. But we'll do it together, and we'll do it on our terms, not theirs. A soft knock at the door interrupted them, and Alexander tensed. They had given strict instructions not to be disturbed, which meant this was either an emergency or someone important enough to override their wishes. Catherine smoothed her hair and quickly wiped her eyes while Alexander straightened his posture, both of them instinctively slipping back into their public personas. Enter, Alexander called, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil of the past hour. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, her usually composed expression troubled. Behind her stood a man Alexander recognized but had hoped never to see in their private quarters. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the king's most trusted advisor and the palace's chief damage control specialist. Your Royal Highness, Mrs. Henderson said with a curtsy. Sir Geoffrey insisted it was urgent. I apologize for the intrusion. Sir Geoffrey stepped forward, his expression grave. He was a man in his 60s who had served the royal family for over 3 decades, navigating them through scandals, constitutional crises, and public relations disasters. His presence here meant that their private crisis was about to become a very public problem. Your Royal Highnesses, he began formally, then paused, taking in their obvious distress. His official manner softened slightly. I'm afraid we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Alexander felt Catherine's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of solidarity. What kind of situation? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Sir Geoffrey glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who took the hint and quietly withdrew, closing the door behind her. Once they were alone, he opened the leather portfolio he had been carrying and extracted several newspapers and printouts. The story broke an hour ago, he said without preamble. Someone leaked information about your medical consultations to the press. The morning editions are already running with it. Alexander's stomach dropped as Sir Geoffrey spread the newspapers across their breakfast table, covering the medical documents with screaming headlines. Heir apparent's fertility crisis, read one. Royal baby hopes dashed, declared another. The most sensational tabloid had gone with, can't produce an heir. Prince's devastating secret exposed. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she read the headlines. How could they know? She whispered. The medical information was supposed to be completely confidential. We're investigating the source of the leak, Sir Geoffrey replied grimly. But right now, damage control is our priority. The phones haven't stopped ringing since the story broke. Every major news outlet wants a statement, and the palace press office is being overwhelmed. Alexander sank back into his chair, staring at the newspapers that had transformed their private nightmare into public entertainment. What are they saying exactly? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The reports are surprisingly accurate, Sir Geoffrey admitted reluctantly. Someone with access to your medical information clearly provided detailed briefings to the journalists. They know about the fertility specialist, the timeline of your consultations, even some of the specific test results. The violation felt almost physical, as if strangers had been rifling through their bedroom drawers and personal correspondence. Alexander thought about all the people who had access to their medical information: doctors, nurses, administrative staff, insurance representatives. Any one of them could have sold their story for what would undoubtedly have been a substantial sum. There's more, Sir Geoffrey continued, pulling out printouts from online news sources. The constitutional implications are already being discussed. Legal experts are being quoted about succession law, and there's speculation about whether you might consider stepping aside. Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Stepping aside? She said, her voice sharp with indignation. Based on what? Medical reports that might not even be completely accurate? Test results that represent just one moment in time? Sir Geoffrey looked uncomfortable but pressed on. Your Royal Highness, the constitutional lawyers have been quite clear about the implications. The primary duty of the heir apparent is to ensure the continuation of the royal line. If that becomes impossible— It's not impossible, Catherine interrupted fiercely. It's challenging, yes. It might require medical intervention or alternative approaches, but it's far from impossible. These journalists are writing our story as if it's already over, as if we've already given up. Alexander watched his wife defend their future with a passion that both moved and strengthened him. In the face of public humiliation and constitutional pressure, she was fighting for them, for their marriage, for their right to determine their own fate. "What does my father say?" Alexander asked, dreading the answer. Sir Geoffrey's expression grew even more grave. "His Majesty is concerned. He's called an emergency meeting with the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury for this afternoon. The implications extend far beyond your personal situation, Your Royal Highness. The stability of the monarchy itself is being questioned." The weight of that statement settled over them like a burial shroud. Alexander had always known that his personal choices would have public consequences, but he had never imagined that his medical condition could threaten the institution he had been born to serve. "They're going to ask me to renounce my claim," Alexander said quietly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Aren't they?" Sir Geoffrey's silence was answer enough. Catherine moved to stand behind Alexander's chair, her hands resting on his shoulders in a gesture of support. "And what if he refuses?" she asked defiantly. "What if we choose to fight this to prove that a king's worth isn't measured solely by his ability to produce heirs?" Sir Geoffrey looked genuinely pained as he answered, "Then, Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid you'll be fighting not just the press and the public, but the very foundations of constitutional monarchy itself. The crown has survived for 1,000 years because it has always adapted to serve the greater good. Sometimes that means making personal sacrifices for the sake of the institution." Alexander felt the truth of those words like a sword through his heart, even as he recognized the terrible choice that was being laid before them: serve the institution by stepping aside, or fight for their personal happiness at the risk of damaging the monarchy itself. As if reading his thoughts, Catherine's hands tightened on his shoulders. "We don't make any decisions under pressure," she said firmly. "Not today. Not while we're reacting to headlines and speculation. We take time to think, to explore all our options, and then we choose the path that's right for us." For the first time since entering the room, Sir Geoffrey smiled slightly. "Your Royal Highness, if I may say so, you're going to make an excellent queen, regardless of how this situation resolves itself." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of emergency meetings, hushed conversations, and carefully worded statements. Alexander found himself in the surreal position of watching his life's most private struggles play out on television screens throughout the palace, as news anchors dissected his marriage and speculated about his future, with the clinical detachment of sports commentators analyzing a game. By evening, he and Catherine had retreated to their private apartments, seeking refuge from the storm of activity that had consumed the palace. The formal drawing room felt like a sanctuary after hours of being surrounded by advisors, lawyers, and communications specialists, all offering their expertise on how to manage the crisis that had engulfed them. Catherine sat curled in the window seat overlooking the palace gardens, still wearing the same dress she had put on that morning when their biggest worry had been reviewing the day's schedule. The setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, where they had often walked together in happier times, before their love had become a matter of constitutional importance. "The Queen Mother called," Catherine said without turning from the window. She wanted to offer her support, but also to share some rather pointed observations about duty and sacrifice. Alexander loosened his tie and sank into the leather armchair that had been his grandfather's favorite. "Let me guess, she reminded you that she gave up her entire life for the crown, and that sometimes personal happiness has to be secondary to royal obligation?" "Something like that," Catherine replied with a tired smile. Though she was considerably more elegant in her phrasing, she also mentioned that she and your grandfather faced their own challenges in producing an heir, and that they considered adoption at one point. This was news to Alexander, and he felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. "Adoption? I had no idea." Catherine finally turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. "Apparently it was discussed very quietly in the early years of their marriage, before your father was conceived. The constitutional lawyers even prepared preliminary research on how it might work within the framework of succession law." "What did they conclude?" "That it would require significant changes to the fundamental principles of hereditary monarchy," Catherine said, "but that it wasn't impossible, particularly if there was broad support from Parliament and the Commonwealth nations." Alexander felt a mixture of hope and trepidation at this revelation. The idea that there might be alternative paths forward, Options they hadn't yet considered was both encouraging and daunting. Did she think it would be viable for us? Catherine moved from the window seat to join him, perching on the arm of his chair. She was diplomatically non-committal, but she did say something interesting. She said that every generation of royals faces a moment when they have to choose between preserving tradition and adapting to survive. She thinks we might be facing one of those moments. Before Alexander could respond, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. This time it was his private secretary, carrying a leather folder that Alexander recognized as containing the most sensitive royal correspondence. "Your Royal Highness," the secretary said with a bow, "a message from His Majesty. He requests your presence in his study at your earliest convenience." Alexander exchanged glances with Catherine, both of them understanding that this wasn't really a request. "Tell my father I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. After the secretary left, Alexander stood and straightened his jacket, steeling himself for what was likely to be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Catherine rose as well, smoothing his collar in a gesture that had become automatic over their years of marriage. "Whatever he says," she whispered, "remember that we're in this together. No matter what decisions we have to make, we make them as a team." The walk to his father's study felt longer than usual, the familiar corridors seeming to stretch endlessly before him. Palace staff members he passed offered respectful nods, but Alexander could see the curiosity and concern in their eyes. By now, everyone in the palace knew about the crisis that threatened to reshape the monarchy. King Henry was standing by the tall windows when Alexander entered the study, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the same gardens Catherine had been watching from their apartment. At 72, the king still cut an imposing figure, his bearing erect and his presence commanding despite the weight of 4 decades on the throne. "Father," Alexander said, closing the door behind him. The king turned, and Alexander was struck by how much older his father looked than he had just a week ago. The stress of the day had carved new lines around his eyes, and his usually perfect posture seemed to sag slightly under the burden of the decisions that lay ahead. "Sit down, son," the king said, gesturing to the chairs arranged before his massive oak desk. "We need to talk." Alexander took his usual seat, the same chair he had occupied during countless conversations over the years, discussions about his education, his royal duties, his future as king. This conversation, however, felt different from all the others. This time, his future itself was in question. "I've spent the day in consultations with the Prime Minister, the Archbishop, and the constitutional lawyers," the king began without preamble. "The situation is more complex than we initially understood." "How so?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The medical information that was leaked included more details than we realized. The press now knows not just about your condition, but about the severity of it. The fertility specialists have been quoted, albeit anonymously, suggesting that even with advanced treatments, your chances of natural conception are extremely low." Alexander felt the last flicker of hope die in his chest. He had clung to the possibility that the initial diagnosis might be overly pessimistic, that further testing or different treatments might offer better odds. Hearing it confirmed by medical experts, even anonymously, made it feel devastatingly final. "The constitutional implications are significant," the king continued. "The Prime Minister has made it clear that Parliament would struggle to support a king who cannot produce an heir. The Commonwealth realms are already asking questions about succession planning, so you want me to step aside," Alexander said quietly. The king was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a lifetime spent balancing personal desires against royal duty. "I want you to consider all your options," he said carefully, "including some that we haven't yet discussed publicly." Alexander looked up sharply. "What kind of options?" "The constitutional lawyers have been researching historical precedents for situations like ours. There have been kings throughout history who faced similar challenges and found creative solutions." The king moved to his desk and withdrew a thick folder, placing it in front of Alexander. "These are their preliminary findings. There are legal frameworks that could allow for alternative succession arrangements, for adoptions that could be recognized by the crown, even for regency arrangements that might allow you to rule while ensuring the succession through other means." Alexander opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning pages of dense legal text and historical precedents. The documents represented hundreds of hours of research into the most arcane corners of constitutional law, all in service of finding a path forward for their seemingly impossible situation. This would require unprecedented cooperation from Parliament and the Commonwealth, Alexander said, as he read, changes to fundamental laws that have governed the monarchy for centuries. Yes, the king agreed. It would be the most significant constitutional reform in our history, but it might also be the evolution that ensures our survival. For the first time in days, Alexander felt something other than despair. The path forward would be difficult, controversial, and uncertain. But at least there was a path. 6 months later, Alexander stood once again at the doors of the morning room. But this time his hand didn't tremble as he reached for the brass handles. The weight of uncertainty that had pressed down on him that terrible morning had been replaced by something else. Not the carefree confidence of his earlier years, but a deeper sense of purpose forged through the crucible of public scrutiny and personal struggle. The room looked much the same as it had on that devastating day, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows and the familiar breakfast setting arranged on the round table, but everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Catherine sat in her usual place, but instead of tears, her eyes held the quiet satisfaction of someone who had fought a difficult battle and emerged victorious, if not unscathed. "Good morning," Alexander said, settling into his chair with an ease that had taken months to rediscover. "Good morning," Catherine replied, pouring his tea with the same ritual that had sustained them through the darkest days of their crisis. The final results from Parliament came through an hour ago. Alexander felt his heart skip, even though they had both known this moment was coming. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of parliamentary debates, constitutional conferences, and public consultations. What had begun as a private medical crisis had evolved into the most significant reform of the monarchy in over 2 centuries. "And?" he asked, though Catherine's smile had already given him the answer he hoped for. "Unanimous approval," she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "Both houses of Parliament have ratified the Constitutional Reform Act. The Commonwealth realms have all given their consent. It's official." Alexander closed his eyes and let the relief wash over him. The legislation they had fought for would fundamentally change how the British monarchy handled succession. It established legal frameworks for royal adoption, created provisions for regency arrangements in cases of medical necessity, and most importantly, formally recognized that a monarch's fitness to rule encompassed far more than biological ability to produce heirs. The political battle had been fierce and often deeply personal. Conservative members of Parliament had argued that they were destroying centuries of tradition. Tabloid newspapers had accused them of putting personal desires above duty to the realm. Public opinion polls had swung wildly as the debate raged in the media and in living rooms across the nation. But they had also found unexpected allies. Modern families dealing with fertility challenges had rallied to support them. Constitutional scholars had argued that the monarchy needed to evolve to remain relevant in the 21st century. Even some of the most traditional members of the royal family had eventually come around to supporting the reforms, recognizing that adaptation was preferable to extinction. Dr. Morrison called as well, Catherine continued, referring to their fertility specialist who had become an unlikely ally in their fight for reform. "The latest round of treatment shows some promising signs. Nothing definitive yet, but reason for cautious optimism." Alexander reached across the table and took her hand, marveling at how the simple gesture that had once felt desperate now conveyed strength and partnership. "Whatever happens with the treatments," he said, "we have options now. Real options." The legislation included provisions for royal adoption that would place adopted children in the line of succession, provided certain conditions were met. It wasn't the traditional path they had originally envisioned, but it was a path nonetheless, one that hundreds of families facing similar challenges could walk with dignity and hope. A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Alexander smiled as he recognized the familiar rhythm. "Enter," he called. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a young couple Alexander had come to know well over the past few months, David and Sarah Chen, the coordinators of the palace's new Royal Family Services initiative. They were both beaming with excitement that they could barely contain. "Your Royal Highnesses," Mrs. Henderson said with obvious satisfaction. "I believe David and Sarah have some news to share." Sarah stepped forward, clutching a folder that Alexander recognized as containing adoption profiles. Over the past 4 months, as the constitutional reforms had moved through Parliament, he and Catherine had begun the process of exploring adoption. It had been emotionally challenging but also deeply rewarding, opening their eyes to children who needed families and families who needed support. "We've found a match," Sarah said, her professional composure cracking slightly with excitement. A 6-month-old girl whose birth parents specifically requested placement with a family who could provide both love and the opportunity for public service. "When they learned about your situation, they asked to be considered for your adoption program." Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat. After months of profiles and meetings and careful consideration, the moment they had hoped for had finally arrived. Catherine's hand tightened in his, and he could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. But these were tears of joy, not the devastating sorrow that had marked their earlier conversations in this room. "Her name is Emma," David continued, opening the folder to reveal photos of a beautiful baby girl with dark hair and bright eyes. "She's healthy and happy, and her birth parents have written you a letter explaining their decision." Catherine reached for the photos with trembling hands, studying the face of the child who might become their daughter. "She's perfect," she whispered, and Alexander could hear the love already growing in her voice. "There's more," Sarah added with a grin. "The birth parents would like to meet you if you're interested. They want to be sure that Emma will be raised with the values they consider important: kindness, service to others, and the understanding that every person has worth regardless of their circumstances." Alexander looked at the photos Catherine was holding and felt something shift in his chest, a sense of completion he hadn't expected. This wasn't the path to parenthood they had originally planned, but it was their path, one that would allow them to build a family while also creating new possibilities for the monarchy and for other families facing similar challenges. "When can we meet them?" he asked, already knowing that his heart had made the decision his mind was still processing. "They're here," David replied with a smile. "In the blue drawing room if you'd like to meet them now." Alexander stood, still holding Catherine's hand, and felt the last pieces of his old life settling into place alongside the first pieces of his new one. The morning room that had witnessed their darkest hour would also serve as the launching point for their greatest adventure. "Mrs. Henderson," he said to the housekeeper who had watched over their family for decades, "would you please prepare the nursery? I have a feeling we're going to need it soon." As they walked toward the blue drawing room to meet Emma's birth parents, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The crisis that had once threatened to destroy their marriage and derail his future as king had instead forced them to redefine what it meant to serve the crown in the modern world. They had learned that true royal duty wasn't about preserving tradition at all costs, but about adapting those traditions to serve the greater good. They had discovered that a king and queen's greatest legacy wasn't necessarily their biological children, but the positive changes they brought to their realm and its people. Most importantly, they had proven that love, whether between spouses, between parents and children, or between rulers and subjects, was strong enough to overcome even the most daunting challenges when it was paired with courage, determination, and the willingness to forge new paths forward. The future that awaited them was different from the one they had originally imagined, but it was no less bright with possibility. As they prepared to meet the woman and man who might entrust them with their child, Alexander knew that he had never been more ready to serve his country and his family with everything he had to give.